Hello, Horror Stories. My name is John, and what I am going to tell you happened to me in 2013. At that time, I lived in Cincinnati, United States, near a cemetery. I had never witnessed a paranormal event before until that night, and I assure you that I would not wish it on anyone. I remember it was Friday because we met some friends in a main square in my neighborhood, and we met there to talk and have a drink. Between chatting and laughing, it had gotten very late. It was almost 3 in the morning when I realized. I grabbed my backpack and walked home. It was a few blocks, thinking about getting there early to go to bed. As I approached the cemetery street, there's a very dark part where there is usually always a homeless person or a group gathered. I tried not to pay too much attention and continued walking quickly, but this time something was different. I felt a strange presence and, although I didn't want to look, an inexplicable curiosity made me turn my head. When I heard someone whisper, "Son, son," to me, I stopped dead. The whisper was faint but clear, as if it were right behind me. At that moment, a chill ran down my spine. I turned slowly, but I couldn't see clearly. I could only make out a figure a few meters away from me. The figure began to move very slowly towards me as I backed away. I asked him what he needed, and then I heard a voice again, like a woman's, an old woman's voice, asking me for help to return to her house. I was relieved to realize that she was just an old woman. I asked him where he was going, and he told me he lived near my house, which I thought was strange because we didn't know each other. Anyway, I decided to accompany her, and we started walking together. We emerged from the darkness, and I saw that it was an old woman with a large hat on her head and an embroidered dress that reached to her feet. You could barely see her face, and she walked very stooped, which showed that she was an older woman. I took her arm, and I must say that I had never felt an arm so thin and fragile. He thanked me for being so kind, and as we walked, the street seemed darker and quieter than usual. I tried to keep the conversation going to make her feel more comfortable, asking her about her family and how she had come to be alone at that hour. His answers were vague and enigmatic, but he responded little by little. She told me that she lived alone. Her oldest son was in the armed forces serving the country, while her youngest son lived in another state with his family. He also mentioned that he had been born many decades ago, but he could no longer remember the year. After a few silent steps, she commented that she was surprised by my outfit, which I found strange. He was wearing shorts, a t-shirt, and an NBA cap. I looked at her strangely as we walked down the almost deserted street. The old woman seemed lost in thought, but it could be normal due to her advanced age. As we drove along, I noticed that the streets were unusually empty and quiet. The only light came from some distant streetlights, creating eerie shadows in the corners. I felt the atmosphere grow thicker with every step we took together. She whispered that no one had visited her house in a long time, and she felt very alone. Hearing that from the old woman made me deeply sad. She could have been my grandmother, and she had really touched me. However, I experienced a strange feeling when he looked up and looked me directly in the eyes. It was as if there was something else in his gaze, something I couldn't quite understand. His eyes, although tired and wrinkled, seemed to have an unusual depth, as if they were hiding ancient, dark secrets. A feeling of discomfort came over me, but I tried to hide it. I tried to be nice and told her not to worry, that she wouldn't be alone now. However, his response was a barely audible whisper, "It's too late for you." The comment left me taken aback, and I froze for a moment, trying to process what I had just heard. Near the entrance to the cemetery, the woman mentioned that she was already close to her house, which surprised me quite a bit because she had initially told me that she lived near my house and there were still several streets to walk. Suddenly, the light at the entrance to the cemetery began to flicker until it went out completely, as if the light bulb had exploded. I felt a chill run through my body as I felt the old woman's thin arms slowly fade away, cursing in a devilish voice completely different from her initial soft whisper. Instinctively, I quickly let go of his arm. Although he couldn't see her in the dark and understand what was happening, he also didn't want to leave her alone there. Without thinking, I backed away and told him I would take my cell phone out of my backpack pocket to use the flashlight. When I turned on the flashlight, the woman's face was inches from mine. I felt his cold breath on my face when I looked into his face for the first time. It was hard to describe because I had never seen anything like it before. His skin clinging to the bones, pale as a skull. I backed away quickly as she pointed toward the cemetery entrance with one arm raised, indicating if I wanted to enter her house. In her hand, she held a rolled black rosary. my legs paralyzed from fear. At that moment, his lips moved slowly as if he were uttering something he couldn't hear. It was as if he were murmuring a plea or a curse, but the wind blowing through the trees drowned out the sound of his voice. I didn't know what to do or how to react, but the need to get away from her prompted me to take a few more steps back. She remained there, with her arm extended towards the entrance to the cemetery, as if waiting for my response. The black rosary between his hands slid slowly, as if it had a life of its own. I looked around, shining the flashlight of my cell phone in my hand, perhaps out of an instinctive impulse to seek help, but the night was deserted. When I turned towards the entrance where she was standing, she had disappeared. With my heart beating wildly, I began to run quickly towards my house. The silence of the cemetery was disturbing. As I ran, my heart continued to pound and my hands shook uncontrollably. I came home with a shaking body and a mind full of unanswered questions. With the images of his cadaverous face and his whispering voice, they did not stop haunting me, reminding me of the strange and disturbing experience I had lived. When I got home, I told my mother and brother what had happened. My mother scolded me for arriving so late, although it was clear that my story disturbed her. My brother, on the other hand, remained silent, listening attentively and with his eyes wide open. My mother, worried, told me, "You must be careful. There are stories about that cemetery. They say that some souls do not rest in peace and look for company." I always thought they were just legends until now. We decided to investigate more about the cemetery and local legends. What we discovered was even more disturbing. Several people had reported similar encounters with an elderly woman asking for help getting home. All those stories ended the same way. She mysteriously disappeared near the entrance to the cemetery. It is said that the old woman had died many decades ago, and based on her clothing, it was estimated that she was from the 19th century and that she had died tragically in that cemetery. She lived alone, near the cemetery, and used to walk through the streets of the neighborhood, always dressed in her big hat and her embroidered dress. One night he mysteriously disappeared and his body was found weeks later in an unmarked grave in the same cemetery. Since then, the legend said that her spirit wandered at night, looking for someone to accompany her to her home. That night, none of us slept well. We stayed awake talking about what had happened and trying to understand the inexplicable. Since then, I never walked alone near the cemetery again. For many nights it was very difficult for me to fall asleep, and I understood that we are not alone in this world, and that the paranormal is closer than we think, although we do not see it. Be careful and prepare, because terror is in the air. If you have enjoyed this story, we invite you to subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any others. Until next time.